Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Bina Di Costa. I'm your moderator for our final panel. And for these 3 days, we've been having such important, engaging, and exciting conversation. And I'm sure that those who have joined in different panels will agree with me. And hopefully the organizers will think about future conferences like this one as well. Before we start, I'd also like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands the Australian National University stands and where I work. I pay my respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, past and present. Welcome again, and thanks for joining us today on our final panel, Rethinking the Development and Environment Binary. We have 4 brilliant speakers today, Professors Camelia, Dewan, Naomi Hussein, Chowdhury, and Lamia, Karim. I'll introduce our speakers in a moment, but before that, I just want to mention that these papers are really complementary, and our panelists here, I'm sure many of you know their work. They've been working in these areas, in these issues for a long time. They work with human rights defenders, they work with women's rights and environmental activists in Bangladesh and elsewhere, and they also work with development practitioners. Please feel free to send your comments and questions through the chat function during the presentations. And at the end of these presentations, we'll take questions from the audience. If you prefer to ask questions directly, you're welcome to do so. In that case, please also feel free to use the Zoom reaction function. May I also request you to keep your microphone mute throughout the presentation. You're welcome to keep your camera on so the speakers are not watching a blank screen, but up to you, of course. So the presenters today, I'm going to introduce them one after another. Our first presenter is Dr. Camelia Dewan. Camelia is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Oslo. She holds a PhD from the University of London, and she's the author of Misreading the Bengal Delta, Climate Change, Development, and Livelihoods in Coastal Bangladesh. It's been published by the University of Washington Press. Camelia's paper is also titled the same. Camelia, over to you. And just before our speakers start, we have 15 minutes for each presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bina. Thank you to all the organizers. And I feel so honored to be on this panel, as I'm not a professor. So with all these other inspiring colleagues that have really inspired my work. So I just want to say I'm really happy to be here and be in conversation with you and seeing you. So it's a great honor. So I will just briefly talk about my book that just got published. It's actually being printed and released this month by the University of Washington Press, and it's my first book, so it's a bit exciting. And I argue that actors in Bangladesh's development industry risk creating flawed causal narratives when linking their development projects to climate change in ways that might not actually fit the actual environmental context, and how ultimately such misreadings of the Delta risks actually exacerbating climatic threats that are going to happen, as well as socioeconomic inequalities in the long term, while also risking to undermine the development of democratic accountability, which I'll go into more. Can everyone see the right slide and not my notes? I should have started with that maybe. Let's see. Okay. So in my research, I combine archival research with ethnography of aid projects on the environment. So I'm very much influenced by the anthropology of development and ethnographies. And I look at how external ideas, external institutions, and external resources shape the current form of Bangladesh and its state, from the creation of colonial railways across the Delta to World Bank embankments and its Bangladesh's dependency on development funding allocated to poverty reduction, modern agriculture, and now climate change. And I'm also a second generation Bangladeshi, born and raised in Sweden. And I've grown up in a society where media portrayals of Bangladesh are often victimizing, pauperizing, and condescending. Even as you order things in the parcel or post, you get these flyers of saving brown kids in the global south, you know? So the image of Bangladesh as a climate change victim reproduces these historical imaginaries of its inferiority while ignoring its complex past. So I hope and want this book to be a decolonial project that historically situates development in Bangladesh and the continued image of the country as poor and vulnerable in order to understand the links between colonial knowledge production and the knowledge production of climate change. And the concept of decolonizing development contests the ways in which development has been used as a way to legitimize external actors radically altering the environment and societies in former colonies of the global south. And this is part of a wider agenda of decolonizing the curriculum and higher education, which is based on the assumption that global histories of Western colonial domination have had the effect of limiting what counts as authoritative knowledge, whose knowledge is recognized, what universities teach, and how they teach it. The university as a privileged space of knowledge production and dissemination is a key site where the historical legacy of colonial social construction, imaginaries, practices, hierarchies, and violence still resonates today. So climate change as a spice, or mashallah, the latest development buzzword. The common reading of Bangladesh as a victim of climate change assumes that as global warming increases, ice caps will melt, sea levels will rise, and low-lying Bangladesh will drown. People will flee because of floods, and increasingly frequent natural disasters such as cyclones and tidal surges will make these migrants become climate change refugees. And this is very telling in this image here, for instance, in the Huffington Post. And Bangladesh is now one of the top recipients of development aid earmarked for adaptation to climate change. But as all of you know, Bangladesh is a deltaic waterscape. It's a land made out of rivers and silt, nodi and poli, shaped by annual monsoons. Bangladeshi development professionals, from NGOs to academics and donors, now try to make their development projects seem related to adaptation or resilience in order to attract aid funding. But do these project descriptions accurately capture the causality of floods in complex coastal landscapes? Might it even risk exacerbating environmental degradation and increase coastal vulnerability to climatic change? So drawing on my book's engagement with climate reductive translations in development, or what can be termed climate change as a spice, I critique development narratives of Bangladesh as a climate change victim. I examine how development actors, mainly Bangladeshi ones, repackage colonial era modernizing projects like flood protection embankments, beribads, which have caused severe environmental effects as climate adaptation solutions. And as all of you know, Bangladesh experiences three types of floods: Borsha, the annual monsoon rains; Bonna, irregular destructive floods in the wake of cyclones and tidal surges; and Jolabodho, waterlogging. So the Bengal Delta has an innate ability to adapt to a certain amount of sea level rise. Silt in these riverine waters can raise existing land levels if the rivers are allowed to flood the plains. So, for example, in the unembanked Sundarbans mangrove, such Borsha monsoon floods raise land levels each year. And silt destabilizes a clear dichotomy between land and water while shaping water's depths. So embanking the delta prevents such floods, right? Embankment stops floods. So silt instead deposits outside embankments and raises riverbed levels. So I'll go into this a bit more later, but basically this image here of this man is a very typical image of Jolabodho, waterlogging, where the water cannot drain out into the river because of the raised riverbed. And actually, natural scientists suggest that embanking Bangladesh's coastal zone poses a greater risk of floods than that of expected sea level rise. So here is a map of the 1960s coastal embankment project that was funded by USAID and what is now the World Bank and the UN with the aid of Dutch consultants. So they're also called polders. And similar embankments were proposed in the 1990s in the flood action plan that Bangladesh civil society successfully contested and stopped. But now in the 2010s and 20s, this very same infrastructure is cast as climate adaptation infrastructure. And the World Bank is currently spending $400 million on an aid project to build wider and higher flood protection embankments based on the logic that sea levels will rise, cyclones will increase in frequency and intensity. This will lead to devastating floods and salinity in Bangladesh, and the best way to protect Bangladesh is to build larger embankments. But what I argue in my book is that by rearranging these events to alter the logic to legitimize the project, the World Bank is in effect reinforcing a climate reductive narrative that does not engage with past experiences of how these flood protection embankments worsen siltation and exacerbate damaging Bonna and Jolabodho floods. So I've worked on embankments since 2010 when I worked for the International Water Management Institute. And it is common knowledge in Bangladesh and among Bangladeshis that embankments make problems of siltation worse, and they kill rivers and canals. And these conversations are usually in Bangla, however, and not part of the public international workshops and talks conducted in English. So I also talk about these public hidden transcripts in my book and code switching between languages. And I attended a local grassroots workshop organized by civil society actors in Khulna on World Rivers Day in 2004. All of the participants criticized the coastal embankment project, and one of them stated, every year embankments prevent more than 1 billion tons of silt in the rivers from depositing on the land. And remember, all of this was in Bangla, so this is translated. The silt instead deposits outside the embankments and raises the riverbeds and prevents the rainwater inside the embankment from draining out the river outside. Embankments are causing riverbed rise and waterlogging. These issues have no link to sea level rise. Even Bangladesh's most famous water specialist never mentions sedimentation because of pressure from international donors. We in Khulna are not able to do anything. We may continue this movement for the environment, but we are all voiceless against those who hold the real power in Dhaka. And in the book, I go more into details about how actually the same actors that say that they're powerless are also performing similar aspects. And it's not like an anti-politics machine as such, but everyone is complicit in playing in this technical game of development. But here I just wanted to show you an image of an embankment from the 60s and 70s during the Wabda period. And prior to the construction of these permanent embankments, there were temporary earthen embankments called Oshtomashi bands. And they were small and low, and they were built not to stop floods. They were built to stop salt water during the dry season from mid-January to mid-June, so that these reclaimed agricultural lands that were once mangroves would not return to being mangroves, but would be used for cultivation. So during the monsoon, these Oshtomashi bands would be broken by all the canals to allow for flooding and irrigation of rice. And it was also a spawning ground for fish. And the silt carried from the rivers would flood the plains, the beals, and they deposited the silt, and this accretion would raise the land levels. And as you can see here, with the embankment, the silt is now depositing outside the embankment, and it's higher than the agricultural land inside. So during the monsoon, the heavy rains get trapped inside and they cannot drain out to the river. And that is what causes drainage congestion or waterlogging, like in the first image with the climate refugee. So the World Bank's project of higher and wider embankments as adaptation suggests the floods in Bangladesh are caused solely by rising sea level and misses the problems that they cause. So basically, embankments as adaptation infrastructure misread climate change in Bangladesh. And such development projects officially ignore a century of experience that demonstrate the ecological damage caused by flood protection embankments, which I go into deeper depth in my book. So while many international experts argue that climate change causes floods in Bangladesh are not just about climate change. My ethnographic research examines the brokerage undertaken by local Bangladeshi development professionals in climate-funded projects. I show how Bangladeshi development brokers partake in development assemblages that are made up of multiple heterogeneous development actors, so different donors, NGOs, state units, and consultants that come together to create a common development project. And the theoretical framework of the book is based on the concept of climate reductive translations. So the policy theory in Bangladeshi climate change projects tend to be climate reductive. They ascribe all causes to climate change, that the country will drown due to rising sea levels caused by global warming. So climate reductive translations help conceptualize how different climate projects produce coherence. They create causal narratives linking development interventions to the policy theory of climate change. And all of them don't have to be World Bank negative for the environment. So for instance, the translation of canal excavation as adaptation is one that is very popular. My interlocutors in my field site that I call Nodi consisted of female and male landless agricultural day laborers and farmers. They viewed the canals as public goods for irrigation and for catching wild fish, and most expressed concern over the many Morakal, where there had once been deep water bodies connecting the river to the fields. And they highly praised a climate change adaptation project entitled Enhancing Resilience to Disasters and the Effects of Climate Change, funded by the World Food Programme with new donors such as Brazil and Japan. And this was a cash and food program providing rural training and work to coastal communities. And it helped to, and it helped make the canal deeper and improved both agriculture and irrigation and local fisheries. And then in the book, I also talk about, so I start off with the history of flood protection embankments, but then I also look at the translation of shrimp, tiger prawns, and high yield agriculture. And I hope I have 1 minute to talk about my last chapter called Surviving Inequality, which highlights the risks of how these climate reductive translations of development exclude local livelihood concerns of what constitutes coastal vulnerabilities. And Professor Lamia Karim's work on microcredit has really inspired me here, because debt and to afford out-of-pocket expenditure on healthcare, education, bribes to get work, and dowries in a social landscape filled with underemployment and short-term micro projects were really the pressing livelihood concerns here, and what constitutes coastal vulnerabilities when voiced through these rural peoples themselves without a project link. So this critique of the development industry and how it risks failing the environment and society in coastal Bangladesh is urgent and intensified with the global COVID-19 pandemic starting in 2020. The intersection of pandemic and cyclonic events highlights the importance of a proactive government, but also the need to create a public healthcare system with universal coverage and to create a system of citizen entitlements to reduce societal inequalities. So for Bangladesh to survive future challenges, long-term governance and infrastructure is of the essence rather than these very short-term adaptation projects. So future research and development intervention should pay more attention to these socioeconomic inequalities, and scrutinize the actions of government decisions like introducing a coal plant in the Sundarbans and expanding industries in agrarian coastal regions. And I'm currently looking at shipbreaking in Chittagong. To what extent may the promise of future growth Unnoyan worsen Bangladesh's current and future problems of environmental degradation, pollution, and structural health inequalities. And I think I went over time, so thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you so much, Camelia, for that wonderful presentation. If I may ask you to turn off your PowerPoint, and thank you. I particularly liked, Camelia, the way you talked about hidden transcripts, and hopefully there'll be opportunities to discuss that, elaborate that a bit more for us. Our second speaker today is Dr. Naomi Hussein. Naomi is a political sociologist based at the Accountability Research Center at American University. Naomi's research is on the politics of development, often in Bangladesh, focusing on how citizens hold public authorities to account for the services they need. The presentation today is titled Geopolitics of Bare Life in 1970s Bangladesh. Over to you, Naomi.
Thank you so much, Bina. And thank you so much to the organizers of this really fantastic conference. I've been to very many Bangladesh at 50 conferences this year, and this by far is the one that has most captured my attention and my interest. And it's partly because I'm a failed anthropologist and a would-be historian, and all of you here are just really amazing scholars, and I've really enjoyed it a lot. What I'm going to talk today is about a paper that actually I first presented about 4 or 5 years ago, and which Elora Shahabuddin, Dina Siddiqui, Navida Chowdhury, others have already heard me speak about and commented on. So it's very, very old. And I do apologize for that, but I thought it was a good fit and I wanted to share this. It's now been published in Third World Quarterly. I wanted to share this because there's things in this paper that I haven't quite come to terms with in my own head. And I thought talking about it with people who are really expert in these areas, particularly in the development environment nexus, would be a way of clarifying for me or helping me think more. Plus, I'm just really interested in these things, and I can talk about, for instance, the concept for Bangladesh until the cows come home. So I'm going to talk a bit about what I call the geopolitics of bare life. And this paper, you know, it's interesting. In the last few weeks, we've seen quite a few papers, quite a few opinion pieces, op-eds, various presentations talking about Bangladesh's changing geopolitical, geostrategic significance. And there's this idea that, because of its geography, Bangladesh has some geopolitical importance with respect to China now that it didn't have before. The fact that it's not India, in the area is also important perhaps for Chinese interests in the area. And I think all of this discussion about how Bangladesh has suddenly acquired some kind of geopolitical importance is fascinating because it really highlights how little geopolitical importance Bangladesh historically had, particularly in the 1970s. And I find it very interesting to think about because I believe that, and I hope I've shown that, Bangladesh's main significance in the world, even though it's such a large country in terms of population and so on, its main significance in geopolitical discourse, if you like, has been as a laboratory for testing development out, aid experiments, I call it the aid lab. And if that's changing, that's interesting. And why is that changing? But that's not so much the subject of my paper today. The paper really is focused on what happened in the early 1970s, what events, what moments in the early 1970s created this sense in which Bangladesh was an aid laboratory, a laboratory for aid, or had no other real significance for the rest of the world. And I think that it is in the construction of Bangladesh and Bangladeshis as bare lives, that this invention of Bangladesh as the aid lab was made possible. It's a bit early in the morning for me, so I won't try to paraphrase Agamben. I will just read from the paper what I mean by bare life. In this paper, I try to understand how Bangladesh went from being perceived as a basket case to being the object of humanitarian experimentalism. And I draw on Giorgio Agamben's idea of bare life to do this. Agamben's account of living beings without sovereignty over the conditions of life and death who are deemed beyond the scope of the law draws attention to how constructions of Bangladeshis helped to justify external intervention. The concept of bare life has been used in a few studies about Bangladesh, in particular around the chitmahals, the enclaves that used to exist, the little pockets of Bangladesh in India, little pockets of India in Bangladesh, and also to some extent in relation to refugees or the Bihari camps. And in particular, I think I was very struck by Hossain's work on the way she uses the concept of bare life in the enclaves, because she shows that bare life can also be about the abandonment by the state, a state of abandonment. She says that bare life is not produced by excessive sovereign power, but rather by a state of abandonment, that is a government that cannot actually save the lives of its people. In Agamben's account of Roman legal history, the figure of Homo sacer was exemplified a form of life that was politically unqualified, so biologically human, but excluded from civic life or the purview of the law. So essentially, I think that this concept of bare life as biological, but without the benefit of the law, without the benefit of the state, is really crucial to understanding how Bangladesh emerged in the 1970s, how it came to be seen in international discourse. And those very early 1970s constructions and framings of Bangladeshis as bare life have persisted, I believe. I've got another piece coming out in Himal South Asian, hopefully next week, in which I look at this resilience of Bangladesh's reputation as a basket case, which is no longer applicable. Of course, there's a lot of poverty. Of course, there's a lot of devastation. And even despite Camelia's fascinating presentation, there is still climate change to contend with. But it's not a basket case. And there are many places that are much worse off than Bangladesh. And yet the reputation persists. And I think it has a functional role, if you like, in Bangladeshi discourse. So in this paper, I talk about key moments in Bangladesh's history that helped in this construction of Bangladeshi's bare life. And the first one was the polar cyclone in 1970. I mean, it really is still now, a very striking, visually striking, very emotional, very horrifying moment. It's still considered to be one of the most destructive tropical storms ever in history. You can see there is a video, a short film made by what used to be Thames TV in the UK, which you can find online. And this is a still I grabbed from there. There are many, many much worse pictures, of corpses, and I don't prefer to use those images, but those are the sorts of things that the world would have seen in 1970. Where Naeem Mohammed has written so well about the televisation. What does he call it? I can't remember the exact words he uses now, but he talks about how 1971 was one of the first televised wars, the Bangladesh War. And I think this is true also of the polar cyclone. It was one of the first televised natural disasters. It's also the first time the world outside of this outside of South Asia really got to have a look at this particular delta, this corner of East Pakistan, East Bengal. They'd never really seen it before. There were other more interesting places in United India, and then suddenly 1970 we came to see it. There are some really, really dramatic descriptions. I was just lucky enough to read the proofs of a forthcoming narrative nonfiction book called The Vortex by Jason Miklian and someone else, I forgot the name, from Sum, in fact, Camelia, from Norway, which is about the cyclone and the war. And you should, when it comes out, please do read it, because the account of the disaster is so desperately moving. I couldn't sleep that night after reading that. It was just horrifying. It really does tell the story in a way that I can't explain. There's one bit of one newspaper article from the New York Times, in fact, where the journalist describes how one couple, a farmer, Munshi Mudansher Billa, and his wife, watched while in turn, each one of their 5 children was whipped away by the storm and never to be seen again. So it was a really horrific moment. The world got to see what was going on here, and it was a moment in which, of course, the Pakistani government famously failed to act, didn't care, said a bit like Donald Trump said about Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. Oh, these people over there, they always have lots of storms. This is something far away, nothing we can do about it. And famously, of course, this triggered first a massive vote for the Awami League in the elections that followed so soon after Bashani withdrew from that election. And then, of course, the war. So it was a really key moment, which, in fact, political scientists tend to ignore in Bangladeshi history in favor of what Layli Uddin said 2 days ago, the kind of ethno-linguistic version of the origins of Bangladesh. But ecology had a role there as well. The next moment, I think, that really helped shape the idea of Bangladesh as bare life is the lovely Henry Kissinger, when he made his famous comment about the basket case. Not his, he didn't start it wasn't his phrase, it was somebody else's phrase, but he is the person who made it famous or infamous. This idea that Bangladesh is a basket case, this label has really clung on. You know, nowadays, of course, we hear it mainly in the New York Times, The Economist, or someone saying no longer a basket case. But the idea that Bangladesh was a basket case, I think, as Camelia said just now, is one of these ideas that, you know, is not without some, it's not totally untethered from the truth, but nevertheless, it conceals the reasons for Bangladesh's economic devastation in the early 1970s, which includes several hundred years of colonial exploitation, among others. I always think this is a really good quote and should be looked at properly. You know, I was looking for pictures of Henry Kissinger online. I found some false quote, a made up quote that somebody has used, but this is the text that came from the US Department of Historians archives. And it's very interesting to me that he, you know, this is in 1971. The actual famine happened in Bangladesh in 1974. So they had some years to be thinking about what they might do if a famine came in Bangladesh. And I wanted to say a couple of things about this. One was that this is actually a really high level meeting. This was not just some, you know, we know the South Asia is not important to the US, but it wasn't some kind of back office chat. This was a high level meeting. This was really important moment in the crisis. And it shows that they were thinking about what would happen in the famine. So the basket case, I think, was a second moment in which Bangladesh came to be constructed as bare life, people who don't have the benefit of law. Then, of course, there was the famine of 1974. Now, it's interesting to me, still not a lot has been written about the famine of 1974. I noticed a lot in the many webinars and conferences I've been to about Bangladesh at 50 that it was a case of don't mention the famine. Sometimes it was, you know, quite explicitly, we were told not to, you know, talk about anything before 1975, but it's clear that it's a very sensitive issue. But it's clear also, I think, that there are some really big questions to be asked about America's role in the 1974 famine, which have not yet been answered. We have Raman Safan's famous piece, but there is still some accountability, I think, to be traced there. And one reason I say that is that I think that there are reasons to believe that the politicization of US food aid, I don't know if people know that US delivered aid very, very late, long after most people had died in the famine, a famine which killed 1.5 million people, by the way, by robust estimates. This politicization of the food aid, I think there are reasons to believe it was as much an exercise in ideology as it was an exercise in any more serious foreign policy interests, any material foreign policy interests. And this, you know, there was this book published in 1968 called, this is the book itself, Famine 1975. And it's a prediction that says, you know, the hungry nations will be asking for aid from America, and America has to use what they call triage theory to decide which countries they should help, because some countries are just hopeless and can't help themselves. This is in 1968, mind you, this is before Bangladesh was born. And this started to inform US foreign policy, US food aid policy in particular. I do believe, and I don't have a lot of evidence for this, but I do believe that this triage theory did inform the response to the Bangladesh famine in 1974. Bangladeshis were, in a way, expendable, geopolitically uninteresting. Let's see what happens if we don't give them food aid. Will they survive or not? I think this was the notion. We have some evidence that this was the case in the minds of US foreign policy makers in 1974. Let's be slow on the food aid and see what happens. Then the fourth moment, if you like, in the history that I think is so interesting is the is the concert for Bangladesh, which I think probably quite a lot was written about and talked about last year. And here I feel, you know, I feel that this was a moment. George Harrison, Ravi Shankar put this concert together out of solidarity. This was not some charity moment. This was not about pitying those poor Bangladeshis. It was very much a solidaristic initiative, but it was framed, it was couched very much in terms of charity. And it really cemented this view, I think, of Bangladeshis as helpless and hopeless. And these pictures, of course, persist. I mean, I think very few of us don't know this album cover. I remember this, I think it's one of the first records I ever saw. My parents bought this in 1972, so I was a very small baby. This was always there in their record collection. I always saw this. It's quite famous from that point of view. And it really did, you know, sear in people's minds, I think, this image of Bangladesh. There's a Simpsons, there's in fact two Simpsons episodes where they have this album featured in various different ways. Nayanika Mukherjee says that that picture of the child on the front solidified the image of Bangladesh. It features a starving child with a bowl in front of them. The image of the child was representative of the starving nation, bowl in hand, waiting for the world community, the global civil society to save it, to protect it. I think these images have lasted despite the solidaristic intentions of the concept, but these also help to construct Bangladesh as their life. And ultimately, I think what
Sorry to interrupt, Naomi. If you don't mind wrapping up, my apologies.
I'm on my last minute now. Ultimately, this construction of Bangladeshi as bare life, as people without help, without hope, I think has licensed a kind of what I call humanitarian experimentalism, an idea that you could experiment in Bangladesh on Bangladeshi bodies in all sorts of ways. I think Michelle Murphy's work on the economization of life, her most recent book, I think really makes this point really, really elegantly. My own work, I think I decided that this humanitarian experimentalism led to Bangladesh being seen as the aid lab, being treated by development actors, in global geopolitics as a space for such experimentalism. And I think those constructions of bare life need to go at this stage. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thanks very much. So our next speaker is Dr. Shantilly. Chowdhury is an associate professor of law at CUNY School of Law with expertise in labor, human rights, and social movements. Her recent articles include charting global economic inequalities and emancipatory human rights responses from the ground up on tea workers in Bangladesh, women's empowerment in the Bangladesh garment industry. And Chowdhury had also been a contributor to an edited volume titled Labor, Global Supply Chains and the Garment Industry in South Asia. Chowdhury's paper today is titled, as you can see, Environment and Labor Rights, Imagining an Equitable and Ecological Future of Bangladesh. Over to you.
You would think by now. Great, so thank you so much. I apologize for keeping my video just for bandwidth and to be able to see the panelists. But at the outset, I want to thank the organizers for a fantastic 3 days. I want to borrow a little bit from Adnan's phraseology of collaborative scholarship and decentering. And I think that, I see these panels and discussions really as a catalyst for discourse amongst ourselves. So I hope that I'm looking forward to the discussion part of it. And I also want to sort of lift up, our moderator, Bina's call for perhaps a more regular and sustained network of Bangladeshi origin scholars coming together. So I really appreciate that. I think this is what makes this gathering so special. So my title today of looking at the intersection of environment and labor, and Naomi and Camelia has sort of done a great job of sort of the historical roots. I'm going to sort of move past that. But I think the larger question that this paper is sort of seeking to kind of answer is what communities and futures are we creating that sustains us all? And when I say all, not to again center humans, which is often centered in human rights law, but also the environment. And so looking at livelihood and life. And so in that way, the Naomi's piece sort of really is complementary. So I'll just go very quickly about a little bit about economic development more in the contemporary, but I think I share Camelia's sort of idea that some of this manifestations and iterations of development are colonial and neo-colonial, and that it's essential. And a key topic and point of my paper is to decolonize development, but also to decolonize labor rights and labor law. So economic development model that Bangladesh has pursued after its independence has prioritized industrial development at the expense of a rural agricultural policy. And I think that we can locate that shift in that early 70s period that Naomi sort of mentioned. The courtship proactively of foreign investors, regardless of whether those investments benefit Bangladeshis. The creation of economic zones with the suspension of labor rights, we see that particularly in the context of the garment sector. And then the placement of coal and other plants, including in the Sundarbans and the gas fields in Sylhet, operated as a subsidiary of Chevron, multinational company, contributes to an environmental destruction, all of which places workers, not just industrialized urban workers, but agricultural workers, particularly in increased precarity. Agricultural policy has also been industrialized, prioritizing shrimp farming in contrast to aquaculture. So on both fronts of labor and environment, women have also been most impacted by the way that global capital exploits labor, particularly we see that in the garment industry, and also makes Bangladesh most vulnerable to environmental degradation, even though the causal or factors of climate change can be most attributed to the consumption in the global north. So any inquiry on these areas, and Nafisa sort of alluded to this literature, must take a transnational feminist praxis. Praxis meaning that we need to understand these contemporary issues in its historical, social, cultural relationships that form gender social relations. So it's not about necessarily being women or women impacted that makes it feminist, but to what extent are they forming gender relations? Because of this development model, I would suggest, and because of the social movement resistance, and that's what I'm going to focus primarily my talk today, on labor rights and to environmental degradation, Bangladesh becomes really a crucial location to study the relationship of law, livelihood, and social movements. It provides a unique opportunity to see the synergies of labor movements and the environmental justice movements. So a couple of key points, and some of the case studies, I will mention, and because of COVID and the ideas that this paper will be in an empirical based case study because of COVID have not been able to sort of do that work. So I'm going to sort of highlight some of the key points from the paper. But before I do that, social movements in Bangladesh have resisted these impacts, as I mentioned earlier. But one of the sort of issues that can be observed is that the labor and environmental justice movements haven't always worked in tandem or in collaboration or coordination. And there hasn't been necessarily a collective articulation of those movements. And so while individuals, high profile prominent individuals have collaborated, and we see that from activists in the National Committee to Protect Oil, Gas, Mineral Resources, Power, and Ports, have worked with organizers, labor organizers in Bangladesh, for example, in the Garment Workers Solidarity, or have worked with lawyers, such as the Bangladesh Environmental Lawyers Association. And some of them have been connected to more left-oriented political formations. However, these individual linkages, mainly led by professional or middle-class urban-based activists, has not necessarily led to mass-based formations or ongoing sustained organizing, a type of peasant worker organizing that we actually see in Bangladesh's and the regional's history. And so part of the sort of suggestion of this paper is, given the dual impact on environment and workers' rights, and they're not necessarily in isolation, because we know that the environment impacts individuals' livelihoods, and given these aligned interests, these linkages need to be strengthened, but with the caveat that it needs to build a more rural, mass-based organizing structure, challenging quite directly the development paradigm, and towards what I'm describing as this equitable and ecological future. We have neglected the livelihoods in rural areas. And I think that part of this shift in decolonizing development will shift our attention to those livelihoods and the works that women and other communities are doing. And Camelia's paper sort of talks about the cows, the fish, and sort of these biodiverse strategies to increasing the livelihoods. I won't go so much into detail about that. So in terms of some of the key points, and I think this is not anything I'm saying that wouldn't be shared by many here today, is that labor rights and the protection of the environment are not expendable in the march towards development and progress, but oftentimes they're presented as oppositional, that in order to have development, in order to have jobs, we need to actually make some destruction or allow for certain interventions into the environment. And I guess the paper is suggesting, no, that is not necessary, and that there are actually efforts by communities to kind of resist this. And the tea workers movement, which I write about separately in their effort to prevent a land seizure, a land grab by the state. This was arable agricultural land under the Bangladesh's sort of land policy would have been actually delegated to the landless, is one example sort of that, of imagining both labor and livelihood as being intertwined. Workers, garment, and agriculture are not opposed to development. I think oftentimes as part of these narratives, especially of development donor narratives, is that it's because there's this nostalgia, this is a romantic nostalgia of our old past of the Gram. But Unayon for workers that I've interviewed and for tea workers is really conceptualized differently, that one can actually imagine both a livelihood without necessarily destroying the environment. The other key points that I wanted to make is to situate the social movement organizing around labor and environmental rights within a larger global movement for workers' rights and environment. By saying this, I just want to really asterisk the point that the locus of the movement work has to be led by and situated by those most impacted. So in the way that I'm mentioning about sort of solidarity, it is not necessarily as an invitation for labor activists and environmental justice folks in the global north to dictate and determine the policy. I think for a recent paper that that's coming out in the spring talks about decolonizing labor movement and trade union imperialism here. So one of the ways I think that we can do that is by using the UN Human Rights Council's recently passed resolution on the right to a healthy environment. I won't get into the weeds of some of the limits of that particular resolution, but some of the highlights of that resolution is that it figures that the necessity of a clean, sustainable, and healthy environment. It acknowledges the impact on women and indigenous communities, and it also acknowledges alternative forms of livelihood, and also gives priority to biodiversity and other ecological agriculture. And so I think it's really an umbrella by which the sort of movements can mobilize around bringing together indigenous communities, agricultural workers, and also urban-based garment workers. The fourth point that I wanted to make is that some of this discussion about labor and human rights can be easily contextualized within Bangladesh law. And what this paper won't discuss this, but this concept of environmental constitutionalism. In the Bangladesh Constitution, we do have a section that talks about emancipating peasants and workers from exploitation. It's been underutilized and under sort of amplified, but that can be a location by which a constitutional right to a healthy environment, to labor rights can be developed. So Bina, just if I have a 1 minute, just wave, because I can't see if you put it in the direct shot. The labor and environmental justice movements are also natural allies against fighting the devastating impact of global capitalism, both who are dealing with the impact of multinational companies. I mentioned in the gas fields in Sylhet, this is a subsidiary of Chevron. And of course, there's much more attention around the garment industry and the role of global brands there. So I'm not going to elaborate as much. The Rampal coal plant that Camelia mentioned earlier is through an MOU, a memorandum of understanding with investors from India. So it's a lot of the corporate interests that drive the labor environmental policies aren't necessarily inuring to the benefit of Bangladeshi citizens.
Shantilly, you have 3 minutes, please. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. So the development policy that, let me just continue here. So I'm not going to go through all of the points of the development model. I think this is an audience that is already familiar with what some of these historical references. But a couple of things I do want to highlight that I think is relevant to this discussion on the intersection of labor and environment is this idea, and I mentioned earlier about the increase of foreign investment, deregulation, and promotion of cheap labor. But I think the other aspect that is, I think, given less attention is how industrialization has led to land grabs and land seizures, and that the land policies also are now being oriented in service of the global capitalism, global economy. And the result of this is that agricultural land is diminishing fast. The economy is experiencing a high rate of urbanization from 1974 to 2001. This has a profound impact on food security, and that also has a profound impact on migration. So it's not necessarily climate justice that creates the migration. It is this development policy and the extraction and seizure of land and the displacement and dispossession of rural workers that pushes them to either work into the garment industry with third world, Twale scholar called Taib Mahmoud calls the reserve army for global capital, and or pushes them out of Bangladesh altogether. So this development policy is actually pursued even though there is an explicit agricultural policy, the cost land policy, to distribute land to the landless, except what the government is doing through legal mechanisms, through the formation of the Bangladesh Economic Zones Authority, is by taking the land and then ceding that land to foreign investors. And so the land policy is really now the next frontier by which I think we do need to pay particular attention. So this paper seeks to focus a little bit more on that. So it's not necessarily that I'm privileging or prioritizing rural workers, but really to kind of amplify and lift up this contradiction of our economic policy, that at once we have this development model, and at the same time we have this explicit idea of land policy, and we have explicit constitutional mandates to address the issue of workers and peasants. All right, so I don't have a lot of time, that I had mentioned at the outset that I wouldn't have that much time to go into the details of a couple of case studies that I'm contemplating. And the Q&A, I would welcome sort of other case studies that you think I should sort of focus on. But the first one that I sort of look at, and I mentioned earlier, is this conversion of the agricultural land for industry. So this, what we're seeing now is the siting of industry outside of Dhaka or the urban areas, and we're seeing the siting of industrial plants on rural arable agricultural land that is being cultivated by people. So I'll refer to the paper. There's a complex land leasing scheme in terms of tea workers. You might wonder, how is it that if there are tea workers, why is there a land issue? That from the time of colonialism, that many tea workers were allowed to cultivate on land as supplemental income. And so that has sort of existed from generation to generation. So this is a huge 500 acres of land in northeast Bangladesh that the government of Bangladesh has by law, under Bangladesh Economic Zone Act. And because legally the Bangladesh government owns this land, is seizing the land. And so there's a massive movement to squat and prevent what I call sort of like direct confrontational movement led by women to prevent the land grab. So at the moment, while the legal ownership remains with the government of Bangladesh, the movement has been successful in stopping the taking of the land. But one of the things that's very key for the environmental discussion is that the reason for opposing the land grab wasn't just their livelihood, but also that it would impact the rivers and create drought and further food scarcity. So that the articulation of the movement demands were both workers' rights as well as protection of the environment, and the idea that you have an industrial plant in the middle of an agricultural space, it will also be pollution and all of these factors. The local tea board, the Tea Research Board also indicated, I see 1 minute, indicated as well that siting of the plant would create environmental hazards. And this designation was done without any environmental impact statement. There's actually nothing within the Bangladesh law that requires the government to do that. There is some vague notions of like, must be done in the public interest, vague standards. But this entire swath of land is being taken without any assessment. If you're interested in learning more about and hearing directly, not from me, from the women leaders, I digitally archived the interviews. It's a part of chaijustice.com, and you can listen to all of the interviews by the tea workers and the women. So the last two things I'm just going to mention, because I don't have time, and I mentioned already, is the Chevron operated gas field. Katie Gardner's done some really great, Zahir Ahmed's done some great work on this, and the locals tried to negotiate a development deal, none of which was actually adhered to. Getting jobs, trying to prevent any kind of environmental impact, none of which was followed. So understandably, communities are suspicious of these development sort of deals. The last thing I'm going to mention is sort of the Noya Krishi Andolan, which is a movement of ecological based households. They're networked farming households where women are preserving seeds, reclaiming their sort of role in rural agriculture, part of poultry food processing, poultry, fish farming, all done with conscious of the economical sort of environmental impact. So these are the 3 and 4 case studies that I'm going to focus on in the paper to illustrate the urgent need to really look at the intersection of the environment, life, and livelihood. But given my focus on law, the way that law plays a role actually in impeding these formations, and also other sort of social obstacles, as I mentioned, that it's so far predominantly a middle-class urban-based movement that needs to sort of shift towards a more mass-based organizing. So I know I'm out of time, over time, so I apologize in advance for that.
Thank you so much, Chowdhury. I'm sorry I had to rush you.
No, you have to rush. I'm Bengali, you have to rush me.
Not a problem. Our final speaker is the wonderful Dr. Lamia Karim. Lamia is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Oregon, Eugene. Lamia is also the author of the acclaimed Microfinance and its Discontents, Women in Debt in Bangladesh, which was published in 2011. Her new book, Cast-Offs of Capital, Work and Love Among Garment Workers in Bangladesh, is due out in fall 2022. I love the title, Lamia. It's coming out of University of Minnesota Press. Lamia's work is on post-colonial feminist theory, gender, development, labor, and social movements. And her paper today is titled Power and Knowledge in Development Sector. Over to you.
You have to unmute, Lamia.
Thank you. All right, you can all hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, I may at some point turn off my video because, if I feel like I'm having some trouble reading. I'm not going to use PowerPoint, I'm reading paper. But first of all, I wanted to thank Layli, Hannah, and the organizers and the panelists for a wonderful conference. It's most invigorating to wake up at 5 in the morning with a cup of coffee and to listen to these challenging thoughts. So without further ado, I want to get into it. What my paper is a set of theoretical observations. I'm not drawing from my own ethnographic research, but in Q&A, I'm happy to talk about it. Here goes. In examining the order of knowledge in development, I follow Gayatri Spivak's theorization of subaltern speech in Can the Subaltern Speak? Spivak has brilliantly demonstrated that subalterns speak, but questions whether elites have the skill or the desire to read subaltern speech beyond their preferred ways of knowing the other. Similarly, philosopher Michel Foucault's insight into how truth and power operate in the representation of social reality and how they make certain constructs more intelligible than others is an analytical frame through which we can scrutinize, open quote, how a certain order of discourse produces permissible modes of being and thinking while disqualifying and even making others impossible, end quote. This power knowledge dynamic is critical in understanding how the development industry is invented, reproduced, and entrenched as an institution and as a body of scientific truths that in turn reorganizes knowledge and resources and prioritizes specific research ideas as legitimate. Here, Naomi's point of the famine of 1974 as missing from our archive of knowledge is very telling. Development discourse is a particular way of knowing the poor that has been legitimized at the level of ideology through the collection of reports and statistical data on the poor. This research reproduces the idea of poverty under multiple categories, such as the poor, hardcore poor, the marginal, the vulnerable, the landless, women, and indigenous people, among others. While these categories are ways to manage large segments of the population toward objective goals, such as the free market, they tend to obscure the structural conditions and class relations that produce poverty in the first place. It is important to query how different forces, both within and outside the nation, collude to invent this category termed poverty research, or the research of the poor and the vulnerable, etc. What are the implicit aims that this research serves? How did the poor become a group with a shared set of problems and interests? And why organize around poverty and not class? This discourse has been popularized by the apparatuses of development, the post-colonial state, Western governments, aid organizations, researchers, and development NGOs. This discursive knowledge formation is held together by the power of writing and speech. Monographs, articles, glossy reports, seminars, symposia, editorials, training sessions, workshops, surveys, graphs, charts, dissertations, audiovisual representations, and social media, and the list goes on. Local and international researchers, NGOs, donors, and increasingly multinational corporations that Chaumtoli spoke of reinforce each other in the production and maintenance of the hegemonic ideas of development, such as women's empowerment. What is empowerment? Empowering someone to what objective? Those questions are not largely questioned. Similarly, human rights. Whose rights are we talking about? Does the poor madrasa student have the same rights? I'm here to hear that, a discourse. The discourse of development function as discourses of exclusion. Within the dominant development discourse, alternative or oppositional voices are largely neutralized. And when they're included, these critiques have no practical effects. I found that Mr. Badruddin Omar, Professor Anu Muhammad, were excluded from these seminars because they did not toe the political line. Questions of economic survival inhibit actors deeply entwined in development institutions from speaking out because they're dependent on these institutions for research contracts. I also found that researchers, local researchers, often did not agree with the dominant discourse or its objectives, but they self-censored their reports. Unpopular views would be evicted and they would be unlikely to get another contract. So you have to see how symbiotic this whole relationship is. Publishing neat scientific documents as facts ushers in a new era of technocratic knowledge. What is evicted from this discourse is the biography of the author. Who is this author? Is the author of the research paper an NGO or World Bank representative or an aid industry consultant? If so, what are the constraints on the production of knowledge? These overlapping conflict of interest issues get silenced in urban research spaces. The researcher who's hired to evaluate NGO projects, and I've seen it many times, often has worked as a freelance consultant for the same institution in the past. And I'm not blaming the researcher, I'm just asking you to think of the power relations, right? How you are brought into this web of power relations and how do you exit out of it? Another telling feature of these development seminars and conferences was the prominence of English. The speakers usually delivered their papers in English and the discussions were carried on in English as well. Usually there were one or two Western donor representatives in the room. The use of English as a mode of communication was done with two purposes in mind, in my opinion. The panelists and organizers were speaking to the donor representatives. In the conferences that I attended in Dhaka, donor representatives rarely spoke. They responded to these research projects behind closed doors with NGO bureaucrats. The English language, which in a former British colony is a mark of class, was used as a form of social control. Communication in these seminars was not domination-free. The participants' use of English inhibited many people from engaging in these so-called dialogues, and they used to call them dialogues, now maybe there's a new buzzword for it, which has functioned actually as monologues. While organizers claimed that these conferences were democratic and open, in reality, there were implicit power divisions that separated the ordinary people from the elite researchers. Scholars who dissented, as I mentioned, from the dominant view were not invited to these seminars. And when I was doing my research, I asked many times, why don't you bring in, Mr. Badruddin Omar or Professor Anu Muhammad as some of the other people who have a different point of view? I was, of course, ignored. This social archive is a specific type of intimate knowledge about the poor, a collection and storage bank in which information concerning who they are, their habits, behaviors, manners, customs, leisure activities, living conditions, possessions, recreational choices, belief structures, etc. is stored. These are documented in schemes that are in turn used to produce development knowledge and policy, but also as a marketable commodity, increasingly under neoliberal market conditions. This knowledge can be used to sell concepts and products to and about the economically impoverished. This data gathering process is a pedagogical tool. It teaches present and future generations of researchers, planners, government officials, students, and NGO bureaucrats how to imagine and construct the poor and vulnerable, how to manage them as objects of knowledge. The texts of development have always been avowedly strategic and tactical, promoting, licensing, and justifying certain interventions and practices, delegitimizing others. The questions to ask then, what do the texts of development not say? What do they obscure? Who do they silence and why? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lamia. We had 4 fantastic presentations. What Naomi was mentioning before, how Naomi was introducing Henry Kissinger, lovely Kissinger, Naomi. It will stay with me for a while. Anyway, I'm going to, we have quite a lot of questions there, so I'm going to be brief, and I'm going to pass, just like mention the questions to the speakers. I've shared those with you separately. Now we'll hopefully have time for 2 rounds because our wonderful speakers really kept their presentations tight. The first question I have is from Rumana Kabir to Camelia. So this is, as far I'm just mentioning, as far as I understand, environmental impacts are assessed for all these development projects. I guess they have not been effective. Where can we find scientific evidence to tell the donors to stop these kinds of unimpactful development work? The second and third question perhaps could be for all the speakers, but I've sent it to Naomi and Shantilly. One from Arfan. I'm still curious to know what are the alternative development model for developing countries available in the global development agenda and how they can protect their own environmental resources and develop too. There's another question from Harisu Raman to Naomi. Given the global system dependency and convolution, how realistic is it for Bangladesh to be a developed country by 2041, as the Bangladeshi government boldly claims? And the fourth question for this panel, for the panelists, whoever would like to speak about, what sort of development discourses circulated among the different political parties, like left and nationalist parties, can we talk about? So I'm just going to pass it on to our panelists. And this time I'm going to start with Chowdhury, you first. Over to you.
Okay, great. So I'll try to answer, I think I was sort of posed 2 questions, sort of alternate models, and then the question about sort of local and national politics and discourse around development. So in the paper, I just sort of mentioned the different models, and I use the word model or, sort of loosely. I think some sort of projects or formations might be emergent. And I think part of the problem is that because there hasn't been sufficient attention to really exploring, researching, and looking at some of these projects that, which is a role for sort of scholars to play, there needs to be sort of more work done on that. So I mentioned first sort of through the tea workers movement, I think that to really build on a land policy and the way in which they're sort of articulating the relationship of land and their livelihood. So that is sort of, to me, one of the reasons why I studied it closely is to sort of look at how those movements formed and sort of what lessons that can be learned and replicated from that. So I see that as like one model, if you will. And then I didn't get to speak as in detail about the new agricultural model, which basically there's different principles, and I can sort of share more details about that. And the idea is to work with farmers and communities to produce sort of non-pesticide, organic agriculture and agricultural produce. That produce, if you've been to Dhaka and if you've been to Shoshaprabotana, are all products that are produced by our farmers with no pesticide, no bishhin. So I think that, to me, that is one sort of alternate development model, but it's not just farming, but there are other food production. So for example, food processing, poultry, sort of, now in the United States, and then in parts of, I'm sure, other parts of the world where you spend more money in terms of organic food, and we have that capacity and ability to do that, and we really haven't really focused on that. So food policy can also be another entry point to challenge the development paradigm. There's been amazing work globally done by Via Campesina in terms of passing what is the historic Declaration on the Rights of Peasants. So those are kind of ways by which, both from the ground, but also utilizing kind of the human rights discourse, we can kind of really create these alternatives. On the left and nationalist politics, I think it's a little bit more complicated. And I'm happy to talk offline. I think the work that I sort of saw in the tea worker study is majority of the tea workers are support or vote for the Awami League Party. But this was an interesting contradiction where there was the Awami League Party that was actually seizing their land. And so I thought that this is the importance of really doing empirical work and really doing ethnographic work, because sometimes when we rely on discourses that are sort of already out there, we replicate the same middle class urban based narratives. And so even though it's not funded, it's very difficult work. And I know that the workers would say, Apa, I mean, I don't know how many times people have told me, like, because that's the perception of our researchers. But anyway, it was much more complex. So you had left parties involved, you had the trade union involved, you had sort of local Awami League trying to kind of balance, because they need their votes, but they also need the support of the prime minister. So it's a much more complex articulation of development. And I think that those narratives really, I think that's what Lamia talks about. So this subaltern sort of narratives really need to be amplified. So I know it's not a direct answer to your question, but I think that there really needs to be more work on teasing out these contradictions a little bit more.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm going to go next to Naomi with the question about alternative development model and environmental resources and so on. Over to you, Naomi.
Great, thank you, Bina. And I completely agree with what Chaumtoli had to say about us being too attuned to the middle class perspectives. And I'd say, when it comes to the alternative development model, and I have my hands up, I'm very much involved with the aid machine, all around the world. I get a lot of money from aid to do research and stuff. So, I'm one of the baddies for sure. But I think that one of the things that I've seen is that, the contemporary aid is quite hegemonic in the way it promotes certain kinds of activities and certain kinds of knowledges in with respect to Bangladesh and development. And yet, so much escapes that gaze, so much goes on officially under the radar of aid, which has nothing to do with aid agendas. I constantly struggle to convince my American colleagues that, just because an organization takes aid doesn't mean that it's necessarily doing it for the aid purposes. There's a lot of subversive use of aid discourses, which I think is fascinating to me. And I think the development alternatives, if you like, emerge through the cracks. And absolutely, Chantoli, you completely nailed it. We need to look beyond that. We need to have much more ethnographic and grassroots research from below, not people like us speaking in English in universities. I think that's important. Bina, there was a question also about convolution. I don't know what convolution means. So if the speaker could explain that to me, then maybe I'd be able to answer that. But I don't know what that means. But the question was also, do you think it's feasible that Bangladesh will be developed in 1941? 1941? 2041. 2041. I mean, it's, the idea of development is changing quite a lot as, especially if you live in the US, you see the poverty and the deprivation and the decline of democracy here. So I think, I think they're going to be recalibrating their notions of development in the global north because they don't want to take care of their sick and their old and their poor. Whereas in the global south, of course, we see, a very different move towards much more protection and much more, no democracy still, but much more social protection at least, and more service delivery. So who knows, maybe the parameters will change. I think it's entirely realistic, though, if growth rates continue, that Bangladesh will be a middle or higher income country within the next 50 years. Yes, I absolutely think so. Next 20 years even. But what that means for the environment, what that means for human well-being, for living good lives, I think that's an entirely other question. And what does convolution mean? Bina, we can't hear you.
Bina, you're muted.
Can you hear me? Sorry, my thing wasn't working. I was just wondering if the person who asked the question would like to go ahead and engage with Naomi. Anyway, so let's come to Camelia. Camelia, I've asked one question and you have another question, which is a very long one from Faisal. Faisal, would you like to ask it at the same time before we pass it on to Camelia? Over to you, Camelia. I think, yeah, I'll come to you later, Saad. Thank you.
Okay, no, so that question is a fascinating one because it goes into what Lamia was speaking about in terms of self-censoring and self-policing, right? So I'm just sharing in the chat for those that are interested in the code switching between public and private transcripts. This is the chapter, this article is based on the second chapter of my book, and that is the performative subversive actions of Bangladeshi development professionals and how they, like Naomi was talking about, they use climate change as a mashallah, but then they try to do things that they want to do, right? So siltation, everyone. And so in this article, there's this embankment affiliated person that I try to anonymize, who in Bangla talks about sedimentation, how embankments are problematic, and he has like decades of experience with the Delta, okay? And then I said, okay, so are you getting this World Bank money to do maintenance work on the embankments because donors don't want to excavate and dredge and fix up these embankments that continuously erode? So West Bengal wants to build higher and wider embankments, but they will erode. Who will pay the costs? And the thing is, if the World Bank has to acknowledge that their infrastructure needs long-term maintenance, that becomes politics. It becomes messy. And the World Bank really does not like messiness. And there's, in my book, I think I also mentioned another water professional who wrote in English in the Daily Star, I think, a critique about the Brahmaputra embankment, and he got blacklisted. He lost his job. So it's all about also maintaining your livelihood and balancing this act. So I would really love more feedback and engagement from all of you in terms of this type of work. And then there was a question from Faisal about, but you can't get rid of embankments, and that is very much true. And we can't, and I'm not denying climate change. I also want to say that, I know I sound very critical of the climate change victim portrayal, but the thing is, we need healthy rivers and canals in Bangladesh. It's a delta country. With rising sea levels, you can't have Jolabo, though that will make things worse. And with siltation, all the water bodies are dying. Like Chaumtoli was saying, we need the ponds and canals and beels to be alive and well to actually withstand these uncertain precipitation patterns. Without the deep and wide canals, how can you retain the monsoon waters into the dry season? People are suffering during the dry season, and all those saline rivers are just encroaching upwards and making people's lives really tough. I mean, have you seen the village skin rashes at the end of the dry season? It's horrible. So one alternative for development is to, okay, the canals do silt up every 5 years. They do. So why not do rural employment schemes that also cover canal excavation and not just road repairs in a way? And the roads are also, because the embankments, we can't get rid of them because they're cash jomi now. People live on them. People don't want to move. And they're roads. people don't go by boat anymore, so they use them as roads. So what can we do? And so in my third chapter, I also talk about, the tidal river management as a silt management strategy and these nature-based solutions for what can you do in the current situation. And also implementation has been a problem, as you know, with the ADB project from the 90s and so on. So how do you compensate people that are negatively affected if you breach embankments to allow silt in? How can that be implemented better and more fair when people don't hold the title to the land? So I could speak forever, so I will just be quiet now. Sorry.
Thanks so
And
much.
please get in touch with me, anyone who wants to talk more via email. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And before I turn to Lamia, I just wanted to request others that please feel free to ask the question directly. I might have to force some of you who have asked some wonderful questions here in the chat function. Lamia, over to you.
In response to which question? The one you sent me, or I can't hear you. I can't hear you.
I can repeat the questions again. The first one that I mentioned is about, let me go back to the question. The first one from Rumana Kabir, I echo so much with you about self-censoring as a professional, how the aid industry operates. This is mainly a comment about neo-colonization mode of development. There's the other question. So from Saima Khatun, there's a question. So within the hegemonic development discourse you have discussed, do you find any tactics and strategies the subalterns are using to make their voice heard lately? How do you envision their agency? Over to you.
Okay. Well, first to the question of, thank you very much. First to the question of self-censorship. As I mentioned, that these are webs of power relations. And in Bangladesh, the development or aid, I am not very comfortable using the word aid, but you know what it is about. Aid in industry, whatever you want to call it, is very hegemonic, very dominant. And it has to do with the pattern of development post-1971, of how Bangladesh came into the global sphere. Right around the time neoliberalism was taking over in UK and the US. It was the beginning of the Thatcherite years, and in 1980, Ronald Reagan, right? So it was working in an landscape where things were shifting. And it's, there was a very interesting book about Bangladesh called I think it's called the Bangladesh Laboratory for Development, written by two economists in 1974, where they talk about the two kinds of strategies you had. One was to do collective development, the model where you would have form groups and community organizations. The other was the more independent, autonomous, entrepreneurial model. And it's the second one that took over to sort of push Bangladesh into, quote unquote, the development path. So self-censorship is an ongoing issue in a country or in a landscape where large institutions dominate the research sphere. And it's very difficult for people to go outside of that. And some do, of course. The other thing that I think we should all talk about is the incursion of NGOs in Bangladesh into all spheres of activities. When I was doing my research in the beginning, and when I started in the late 1990s, I met a single person who has formed an NGO. So what is an NGO, right? Theorize an NGO. NGO is a way of organizing resources and people. So why was this single person an NGO? Because it allowed her to access resources as an NGO, but not as an individual researcher. So there are all these different kinds of ties that we have to look at when we are thinking of the Bangladesh situation. For example, the Rohingya issue in the coastal area of Cox's Bazar, if you go there, you will be hitting an NGO every 5 feet, right? Because they're all there to help the Rohingyas. Are they really there to help the Rohingyas? Yes. Are they there to also help themselves? Yes, right? So there are all these things that are, floating around in the same space. Now, moving to the more, I think, complex question about, the tactics and strategies the subalterns are using to make their voice heard lately. Well, subalterns have been talking always. It's that we haven't been able to hear them, right? So my first invitation to everybody, especially people who do research, is to step outside of the given text. Who do you talk to when you do research? Where do you go? And then start doing something different. So when I go for my research, and I'm not taking myself as a model, but I'm just telling you how I do it, I go and talk to the school teacher in a village. I go and I talk to the madrasa person, or the mullah, the local mullah. I talk to different people, like the women and the men, but I also talk to the local people who consider themselves to be the power brokers. So but I rarely go. My first stop is not the NGO, right? I go to all these people. I sort of try to understand what they're saying. So there are many different ways in which the subalterns do think about their strategies, and you may or may not agree with it. But what we have to think about is micro processes, right? What are the micro ways in which people resist, which people try to organize some resources, they try to get their voices heard, and how they form groups. And there have been many small, resistance movements in Bangladesh over the last 20 years or so. So there are where you will go. But again, I want to remind everybody, subaltern speech is always there. We have to find ways to hear them.
Thank you, Lamia. We're running over time, but because it's on the last session, I hope the moderators won't mind if we go over a little bit. Thank you, Layli. So we have 4 people who I'm just going to call out now for their questions. So Saad Qasem, Harisu Rahman, Ilora Shabuddin, and I think Adnan Hussein last. Layli, if you don't mind unmuting them, I can't seem to do it. So Saad first, I think.
Yes, thank you. It was a brilliant presentation, brilliant panel with very, very good presentations on alternative ways of looking at how environment and climate change and development can be accessed. I just wanted to, and especially Camelia Dewan's main point on the flawed casualty of development and Chaumtoli taking it to another level and talking about reproducing it constantly and the effects of that. I think that has a lot of resonance, and I just wanted to know, as that comes through, Camelia, in your paper or in your book, you talk about development policies and the flawed casualty, right? But what about climate change and the global discourse on how we understand climate change? How is that being understood? Does that come up in your work, or should it, or do we have another language to talk about that? And the second question is to Naomi Hussein, from whose work I know most about the 1974 famine. And in that regard, I just wanted to ask a more theoretical question on bare life and how we understand biopower today. And I think it's important to understand, for me at least, to understand why you are dealing with bare life at a time in which, in a special period of time when things are actually not working together. Shouldn't it always be the position? Isn't that the default already? Right? Well, why is it that the state crumbling is the time when you see bare life? Shouldn't it always be there? Hasn't it always been in colonial, post-colonial, modern nation states, or even during the time of war? That is one. And yeah, I think, and I wanted to add that the alternatives to development, the Noya Krishi Andolon has 6 parts on YouTube for us to see. They actually exemplify the triage theory and how it came to place in Bangladesh. Chaumtoli might be able to give a better reflection on that because she brought it up, but it actually puts things together and synthesizes. So yeah, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Seth. Harisuri, you're next.
Just a supplement. I asked a question to Naomi Hussein. It was related to like the government's claim about the development, like they will actually take us to the ladder, like the highest stage of development in 2041. And as Naomi mentioned that it's easier for us to go there, I guess. Can you give us some ideas? Like the word I used, convolution, is more of like entanglement, that we are living in a world where which is very much conditioned, like the development, or think about the economy of Bangladesh. It's very much dependent on remittance and garments. So if any country imposes any bar, like the United States, or increase tax, then our development is not in our own hands. So how come you become so sure about the path of development? Is more of unilinear way to see the growth. Like over the last 50 years, we got only $2,000 if we go with the World Bank. But you know, in the next 20 years or so, we need to raise it like over $10,000. So how come you become so sure? Can you explain on that?
Thank you, Harsher. Ilora, over to you.
Hi, thank you. These are four brilliant papers, and it got me thinking, and I learned a lot. I actually have a very specific and narrow question for Naomi. Let me see what I said, but it connects also to points raised by Lamia about the politicization of development and that bigger project. So my question was, have you tracked the representation of the 74 famine over time within Bangladesh? I'll just read what I wrote, because has it varied with which party is in power, because the famine has been associated with a particular party, and hence don't talk about the famine this year.
Bina, should I go, or are you going to take more questions? You're muted again.
There's some question from, I think there's an additional question from Adnan.
There's just one more question from Adnan, and then I'll pass it on to you, Naomi. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, thanks for the brilliant presentation. So I wonder to what extent this lack of multiple models on the development scene in Bangladesh is a result of or lack of, lack of interdisciplinarity, not just in an academic sense, but also in the way only people from particular disciplinary traditions actually dominate the scene. So, like in for example, in development, we see only economists trained in a very neoclassical tradition, dominating, right? And always kind of advocating mathematical models. Yeah, and also in a similar way, in terms of environment, we see maybe engineers like trained from within BUET are the ones actually having the ultimate say about what matters. So yeah, I mean, I wonder like to what extent that is an issue, because oftentimes these are conversations that we see happening, within the context of critical geography, anthropology, sociology, economic sociologies, right? But mainstream economists who dominate the policymaking scenes are not the ones listening to it, and are often not even part of these conversations. They have their own conferences, right? Very insularized. And relatedly, the other question, perhaps it is directed to Lamia, Karim, is about the subaltern sort of voices, right? So I don't think it's really a problem to be able to kind of listen to subaltern voices, right? I mean, it's a question of methodology one can adopt. But the problem is, how can we make those voices matter? How can those voices be taken into account in how people reframe and rethink their policies? And that is something I think is not happening. And lastly, the dominance or the influence of NGOs seems to be waning in the Bangladeshi context. It's not really there. I mean, I think it is the state that has taken over the agenda of development, and they're the ones leading the show. So what does that mean for Bangladeshi development? And I don't see them being an active, strong actor, neither in development in the service delivery sense, or even in terms of civil society kind of organizing. So they aren't there, except perhaps in Cox's Bazar. So what does that mean for how we can approach, or how we can, I don't know, like, so what does that mean for development today? Yeah.
Thank
think
you, Adnan.
specifically for everybody, maybe, I don't know.
Thanks. I have to cut you off there. I'm sorry. We have the last question for this panel from Naveen. Dr. Naveen Murshid, over to you. And then I'm going to go to the panelists.
Everyone, for such a wonderful panel. This was very thought-provoking. And well, my question, I guess, like a true Dishi academic, is more like a comment, which is this: that I was very struck by how Naomi Appa's discussion of bare life to just talking about citizens in general, not citizens that we'd like to delegitimize, kind of becomes part of the thread along all of these presentations, right? That if we sort of think about bare life as sort of not having political rights, not having any kind of a civic identity, then we are really talking about approaches that do not take into account indigenous voices, take into account local voices and local understanding. Those are part of a bare life narrative too. And I guess, also kind of responding to Saad too, and thinking about how bare life isn't a dichotomy, but rather a continuum, rather a question of degrees, right? And how it becomes something that's useful to understand, detainees from the war on terror, but also rural communities who are essentially sidelined by development, right? And I think it bears to be sort of to be seen and to think about how we as academics participate in some of these too. And I was just telling Lamia on a comment that there are so many South Asian or Bangladeshi academics who would like to sort of pretend to be the subaltern when in fact we actually are not, right? And how that's part of the problem too, as we sort of try to think about what all of these questions are. Sorry, there's really I cannot formulate a question here.
No worries, Naveen, but thank you. We have seriously run out of time, but I'm going to just go back to the panelists for their reflection, and then Shopon Bhai, you'll have the final 30 seconds, if that's okay. So Naomi, over to you first.
Thank you. And thank you. What fantastic questions. And, I feel almost panicked because I want to talk to everyone about everything. And, this is our chance. And, we're already over time. Fantastic questions. Thank you so much. So Saad, you asked a very quite difficult question. And, I'm not sure I know the answer to this, but to say that, perhaps the construction of bare life is always a political intervention. And, it comes at a particular moment in Bangladesh's history. Before 1970, the outside world, by which I mean America, didn't know that this place existed, didn't know. There's a famous CIA report published in, just as Bangladesh was born, saying, oh, we've never seen such a place like this with so many people living on nothing, so concentrated. And, this is Americans who are from Wisconsin or somewhere with the millions of acres of rolling fields and agriculture and so on. And they're coming to Bangladesh thinking, how are these people going to survive? Horror. So this it's a political intervention, partly because it's the first time they see us, I think. But yes, it goes much further back than that. And Haris asked some very good questions. And I think I have a sense now of what convolution means. I was going to say something, this will probably be quite controversial. I'll say it anyway. I'm quite optimistic about Bangladesh's growth and development. And I won't say about its politics and human rights, but about its growth and development, because we have for the first time what we call in political economy analysis a dominant party state. And that dominant party state has strong developmental state tendencies. It's not purely predatory. There are reasons to believe that this ruling government, despite its failings, actually has a development agenda and it's pursuing that, and it can pursue that because it has no political competition, in fact. So controversial statement out of the way. This is how I think, this is why I think that growth is very likely. By the way, I don't vote in Bangladesh, so I have no dog in this game, as they say. Gosh, so many good ones. There was another one, Adnan, you were talking about NGOs, and I just want to say what a very good point that was. The NGOs in Bangladesh, they have some legacies now. Of course, BRAC is huge, others are huge, but they're kind of, they don't play the role. We did some research on COVID and they were just, quite unimportant in the COVID response. That moment has passed, civic space has closed to such a degree. But the really interesting thing is, I keep telling everyone about this, Sahir Ahmed, the anthropologist from Jahangirnagar, he said to me, Naomi, government has become an NGO. in Bangladesh. If you go to look at what's happening with respect to local government around the country, says they're holding, Utan Boytok, they're having meetings, consulting the citizens, all this participation. I mean, they have basically stolen the mantle, if you like, at the local levels. Us who sit in Dhaka or worse still in Washington, DC, can hardly see this, but people I know who spend a lot of time working with local government in unit bushels and so on see this. So I think this is fascinating to see that government has taken on this agenda to some extent, even though it conceals it perhaps from us Dhaka elites. I'll stop there, even though there were many other good points I would love to respond.
Thank you. Lamia, I'm coming to you. If you don't mind being brief, thank you.
Yeah, I'll be very brief like my paper. First, Adnan's point about subaltern voices, and as you mentioned, Adnan, and I also mentioned, and I think many of us know, the subaltern always speaks, right? And it's not only a question of methodology, though, Adnan, it's also a question of empathy. You have to see the other not as another, but as an equal, as someone like you with hopes and dreams and aspirations. And just like we speak, everyone speaks, right? So I think I'm speaking as an anthropologist, and Adnan, you're also an anthropologist. I think that is one way in which you can start engaging with subaltern voices. And from those voices, from the ground, you can start rethinking how to conceptualize and frame what communities need. Another thing, going back to Naveen's point, was that the ways of seeing, how we see, and it's a social conditioning we have, how we envision things is socially conditioned. So the question for me is, how do we break it? How do we realize the frames with which we are thinking, and how do we break out of it? And finally, back to the point about the NGO that Naomi just talked about, becoming a state. The NGO is a shadow state. There's very little difference between the NGO and the state in many post-colonial countries, especially under neoliberalism. So I'm not surprised that the state has taken on many of the functions of the NGO, whereas in the beginning it had outsourced it, now it has reinvented and it's moving in that direction. Doesn't mean the power dynamics have changed, maybe the power dynamics have become more toxic. And finally, the point I want to raise is about Bangladesh becoming an middle-income country. Somebody mentioned maybe we'll go up to $10,000. Let us please talk about distribution of wealth. I don't hear that. It's not enough to just measure in these metrics, right? $5,000 per capita income or $2,000 per capita income, but is it being distributed? Who's getting the wealth? That's it.
Thank you, Lamia. Chowdhury?
So I think of the questions, the two that I think I wanted just to maybe pinpoint is the Adnan's questions about interdisciplinary and the comment about the state sort of becoming the NGO. So again, in terms of interdisciplinary, I think this is something that I've been really intentional about. I mentioned the archive when I was doing my work around garment worker research. It was I also produced a film, and part of this, what I'm calling sort of democratic scholarship, is really that the authorship of some of these issues is to really explore non-traditional mediums by which some of these voices can be articulated. So in terms of making the voices matter, it's not simply to listen. That's the first step. And I really appreciate Nasrin's sort of talk about Bhaiwa music, because in the environmental context, I'm listening to Bhatiali all again, and folk music as discourses, as theoretical discourses. So the listening is very much important in terms of how development is even articulated. The way that we're articulating is not, Spivak Salvalchin basically cannot speak in the current state structure. So how do we create those structures? So one is to listen, to integrate in our methodologies, co-authorship and other ways, but I think also to kind of make those voices centered in policy discussions. It's so hard. And then, for example, when I go to Bangladesh to have, say, meetings or conferences that are not in Dhaka, people don't want to travel outside. It's just something so simple and almost seemingly banal. but really makes a huge sort of difference. So there's multiple ways to do that. As a lawyer, I think about how does law create those alternate spaces for voices to emerge? So for example, the environmental impact statements. I'm not in favor necessarily for some kind of ritualistic form of bureaucracy, but that process allows peasants and workers to come and testify and give, say their voices. So there's a lot more to say about that. My point is there's a lot more that we could be doing to ensure that voices matter, and also to at times perhaps take a sort of a back seat in terms of, even though we integrate individuals, at the end of the day, we're the ones who are presenting, we're presenting in English. And so it doesn't really allow for actually democratic scholarship. So I wanted to mention on that. And I suppose there'll be if we were in person, we would have chai and a longer discussion about the state, development, and NGO. Suffice to say that I'm not as optimistic. I think that we underestimate the role of the state and the sort of hegemonic policies that the current government is sort of promoting around development, and that the discourses, and so I'll sort of end with this. And when I asked some of the tea workers, Sheikh Hasina to apnaদের জমি নিচ্ছে চেষ্টা করতেছে, and they're all pro-Awami League. So go, no, আপা, ওরা জানে না। আপনি ঢাকাতে গিয়ে শেখ হাসিনাকে বলবেন. So you go to Dhaka and you tell, as if I have that, but to go to Sheikh Hasina, like, কি বলবেন? So part of my archive is like, what would you tell the government about sort of these land issues? So I think the narrative and the rhetoric has been perhaps perfected, but the development agenda, particularly with the formation, for example, the Bangladesh Economic Zone Authority, and many more sort of legislative effort, has been to actually institutionalize and by law codify what is, I think, a very dangerous development agenda. So I think that, so this last point is this is the moment really of disruption and of this sort of development narrative. And this disruption has to happen through grassroots, mass-based mobilizing. It's not going to happen in these conferences, and those infrastructure have to be built. And so Nayakushi, the tea workers, have these emergent formations, and we should really be supporting those formations, not NGOs, not other formations. So I'll just end there.
Thank you. Sorry to cut you off. Camelia, you have the floor now. Over to you.
Thank you. I got some different questions. So one was on how climate change came out in my research. And the way I phrased my questions to people was, how do you think the environment has changed? To make it broader than putting climate. And this was in 2014 and 15, where that was always talked about in English. And so the key things then were like the quality of rivers and canals and siltation, and then also salinity due to tiger prawn cultivation, soil acidification and biodiversity loss due to green revolution technologies, and so on. So, but over the years, people are now also more concerned about changing rain patterns and temperature shifts and so on. So that's just a short one. And then I also think the famine question is interesting, because in my agriculture chapter, I talk about Bangladesh as Malthusia and critique it and go through the colonial histories of famine and these export models of tiger prawns, for instance, being pushed and using local land resources to sell food away to the global north is highly problematic. And this is something that has been ongoing since colonial times, as well as the intensification of land use, not having a fallow period to let the soil rest and let people just have cows grazing for free and getting cow dung and so on. So I talk about those different things. And then I got a very interesting and complicated question about how the legal personhood of rivers movement can situate itself within a proletarian post-statist form of transboundary river politics, climate politics across South Asia more generally. And I have an amazing colleague at Oslo Met called Rahul Ranjan, who is part of the Riverine Rights Project that looks at these in more detail. I haven't looked into that myself, but knowing in my field site, there was an andolon against tiger prawn production that was completely grassroots, organized from the bottom up by local people. And interestingly, they managed to end tiger prawn cultivation in the part of the polder that had small landholding shares, so small farmers. But in the southern part, there were large landowners, and there the movement failed. So my book is a contrast between the area, which I call Dhanmati, where the movement succeeded in restoring life to the soil with freshwater cultivation, and then Lona Nodi, where it failed and continues with tiger prawn. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Camelia. I'm afraid we have run out of time, but Shopun Bhai have been very patient, so I'm going to go to Dr. Shopun Adnan for your very brief comments. Over to you, Shopun Bhai.
Thank you, Bina. Well, let me first of all say that it's been very stimulating to hear again, much more forcefully than I've heard in recent years, the critique of the development apparatus, particularly given the bloated claims of Bangladesh being on the development highway and nothing else not mattering. So that I think has been an extraordinary experience. Also, the fact that participants here have questions, things like, how can you do poverty analysis without analyzing the causes of poverty? These questions were asked earlier, but then I think we were much more lonely, and it's good to see that there is a new generation of scholars who are bringing this up. I just have a few specific comments to make. I've not read Camelia Dewan's book. I just wanted to know her key point about siltation raising riverbeds, whether she mentions Prashanta Chandra Mahalanobish's work, because that is where the idea comes first in 1927. The second thing there is that as the master plan was implemented, the way people could resist this apparatus was by actually breaching the embankments, something that became known as public cuts. And this was people's resistance in a way that the state could not fight. The state could not police hundreds of miles of embankments. The most brilliant example of this was the Bil Dakatia movement, which led to the breaching of the embankments there, one of the coastal embankment boulders. The development apparatus in Bangladesh, of course, also was very wily. When resistance to the flood action plan began to mention all of these things that we knew from earlier, there was a switch in strategy. People's participation was brought in, and you can expect, as you can expect, NGOs were brought in as contractors, subcontractors to help with people's participation. And that's how that movement was to a large extent divided. On Chaumtoli Hawk's issues about land grabs, one issue I wanted to say is whether people evicted from land are to be regarded as the reserve army of labor. I think not. Reserve army of labor really applies to people who are retrenched from industrial work. Now, on the tea workers, what you see is this land grabs by the state apparatus and people's attempts to resist that. This is also something that is happening widely in Bangladesh, and also more recently in Govindganj, the Chowdhury lands were taken over. You remember the sugarcane factories had been given this land. And we see their resistance being ruthlessly crushed, indeed police being sent in and the police setting fire to the huts of the Chowdhury. So this is the kind of state development apparatus that we have to deal with. Thank you for all your ideas on how we go about that.
Thank you so much, Shopun Bhai. With this, I am going to formally end our panel, absolute brilliant panel. Please thank our amazing speakers and feel free to reach out to them because I'm sure there were so many other questions and comments. And thank you, everyone who's been here with us. I'm going to pass it over to Layli. Over to you, Layli.
Thank you. Thank you, Bina. So I have a few concluding remarks, really, just to say On behalf of Queen Mary South Asia Forum, as well as the organizers, I really want to thank you for 3 wonderful days of critical, reflective, and engaged conversations. This would never have been possible without the wonderful papers from the presenters who just took our call to think beyond the usual tropes and narratives seriously. And it certainly would not have been possible without the sustained engagement of the audience who kept pushing the presenters to think further. I'd also like to thank Bina here for helping us to moderate. It was indispensable. Thank you so much. So please, everyone, just give yourself a huge round of applause for being here and for being here. We wanted this to be a celebration of the Bangladeshi people, but also a reflection on the challenges and failures of the last 50 years. I think that's an important pedagogy for us for us all. Our object also was to uplift Bangladeshi scholarship by platforming a diversity of voices, particularly those who are less exposed, as well as represent that sort of rich critical scholarship being produced by scholars in and from Bangladesh. We have done that well, I think, but we're also acutely aware of how we've just scratched the surface and how many great scholars we weren't able to invite. And so many of them are already here. This helps. The only thing that I can say about these shortcomings is that it helps open the possibilities for more collaborative endeavors, which we've already been talking about. And we'll definitely think about that when we think about ways to move forward, hopefully. I wanted to thank Rick Mukherjee, who's a student at Queen Mary, for providing technical support throughout the conference. Finally, I'm going to turn to my 3 co-organizers, Hannah Shams Ahmed, Nasreen Kandukar, and Saeed Fardos, and say thank you. This conference has happened only because of the collective energy, imagination, labor, and support. I could not have asked for better solidarity and better co-organizers. We'll be putting up the recordings of the conference. If you have any questions, just email us. But thank you again for your time and labor at this conference, and see you sometime in the future, hopefully. Take care.
Bye.